An entry-level job can now ask for strategic judgment, leadership, and stakeholder management before the applicant has much workplace experience at all. In PwC's U.S. postings data, senior-type skills appeared roughly 7 times more heavily in the most AI-exposed entry-level occupations than in the least exposed. Why would jobs become easier to automate in some places while becoming harder for humans to enter? And if you've already spent 5 years building experience, what does that do to the value of what you know? The strange part is that the job title doesn't have to change for the entrance requirement to move. A company can still call a role junior while changing what it expects the person to handle on day one. Think about what entry-level work traditionally did inside an office. A junior analyst built the first model, a new marketer drafted the first report, and a consultant assembled the first round of research. That work produced something useful, but it also did something less visible. It trained the person doing it. You learned what a bad assumption looked like, because someone corrected yours. You learned which client request mattered, because you watched a senior person push back. And after enough repetitions, the judgment that once belonged to your manager gradually became yours. That is why a job is more useful to think about as a bundle of tasks than as a title. Change the bundle, and you can change the career path without eliminating the job. The first evidence that this bundle is moving comes from what employers are advertising. PwC analyzed 2.4 million U.S. entry-level job postings and defined entry-level as roles, asking for 0 to 2 years of experience. It then compared the skills appearing in those roles in 2019 with the skills appearing in 2025. In occupations researchers classified as highly exposed to AI, newly appearing skills were far more likely to be capabilities that historically showed up in senior roles. The difference was about 7-fold compared with the least exposed occupations. That is the number worth remembering. Not because it proves companies are replacing junior workers with software. It doesn't. It shows that the advertised human requirement is changing fastest in the places where AI has the greatest potential overlap with the work. PwC found another split inside those exposed occupations. Entry-level postings it classified as seniorized grew 35% from 2019, while the other entry-level postings declined 10%. Again, those are job ads. They are not hires, promotions, payroll records, or proof that every requirement survived the interview process. But job ads do tell us what employers believe they can ask the market for. And right now, some of them are asking beginners for capabilities that used to arrive later. The title can stay junior while the expected human contribution moves upstream. The reason this might happen becomes clearer when you look at the work itself. Consider a marketing analyst producing a weekly campaign report. If software can create a competent first draft in minutes, the first draft becomes less scarce. But somebody still has to notice that the conclusion is misleading because one campaign had a broken tracking tag. Or take a consulting analyst summarizing dozens of documents. Producing the summary can get faster. Knowing which source is outdated, which claim is unsupported, and which finding can survive a client meeting is a different task. The same thing happens in finance. A model can be assembled quickly, but somebody still owns the assumption that changes the decision. Those are not identical jobs, and managers won't redesign every workflow the same way. But the economics share a pattern. When the cost of producing a first pass falls, the relative value of reviewing that pass can rise. PwC's task analysis points in that direction. Among tasks added between 2022 and 2025, new tasks in the most AI-exposed occupations were about 2.5 times more likely to rely on human-intensive capabilities than those in the least exposed group. Those capabilities include judgment, creativity, leadership, empathy, and human presence. That doesn't prove software caused employers to rewrite every junior job. It does show that the human side of exposed work is moving toward things that are harder to learn from a prompt. The cheap part can move toward production, while the expensive part moves toward judgment. And judgment has an awkward feature for an entry-level labor market. It usually comes from experience. One large employer is already experimenting with what that problem looks like from the inside. In August 2026, AUS announced a program called Career Residency for early career workers. Instead of stopping after a conventional summer internship, participants are expected to spend another 8 to 12 months combining paid client work, coaching, coursework, and technology exposure. EY says the program is designed to build critical thinking, professional judgment, communication, collaboration, and AI fluency before participants move into full-time roles. The first cohort isn't planned until 2028, so there is no outcome to judge yet. That matters. EY is evidence of one employer's response, not proof of a labor market trend. But the design is revealing. The company isn't assuming that better technology removes the need to develop beginners. It is building a longer runway to develop the capabilities it believes the next version of the job requires. That is one management choice. Another employer could use the same productivity gains to hire fewer juniors. A third could keep headcount steady and simply produce more. Technology changes what is possible. Managers decide what happens to the capacity it creates. And this is where the simple story about AI raising the entry-level bar runs into a serious problem. Employers were raising the entry-level bar before ChatGPT existed. Economists Alicia Sasser-Modestino, Daniel Shoeg, and Joshua Balance studied 82.5 million online job postings from 2010 through 2014. They found that when local labor markets were weak, employers asked for more education and more experience. When those labor markets tightened, some of those requirements came back down. Their natural experiment evidence around the fracking boom strengthened the argument that labor market conditions themselves can change what employers demand. That matters in 2026, because the U.S. hiring market is not especially strong. Payroll employment changed little in July, with a decline of 23,000 jobs, while unemployment was 4.1%. When more qualified people are competing for fewer openings, a manager can ask for experience simply because the market may deliver it. No automation story is required. That doesn't make the AI pattern disappear. Remember, the senior skill shift in PwC's data is much larger in highly exposed occupations than in the least exposed ones. A general slowdown alone doesn't neatly explain that difference. But PwC measures exposure, not whether each employer actually deployed AI in the workflow that produced each job ad. That distinction is the line between a strong signal and a clean causal result. Stanford's payroll research through June 2026 points in the same complicated direction. Among workers aged 22 to 25, employment in more AI-exposed occupations was about 19% below the path implied by less exposed peers. The difference appeared mainly through reduced hiring rather than a wave of layoffs. But the researchers themselves described the finding as early and descriptive. So the honest conclusion is not that AI made entry-level jobs require senior skills. The evidence doesn't get us that far. What it does show is a distinctive seniorization pattern in exposed work, a task mechanism that could produce it, and a weak labor market that gives employers another reason to enforce a higher bar. Two forces can pull in the same direction without contributing equally. Once you put those forces together, the economics of the hiring decision become clearer. Training a beginner has always cost more than the beginner's salary. A new employee works more slowly, makes avoidable mistakes, and consumes time from people who already know the job. Companies accepted that cost partly because the beginner was also producing useful lower-stakes work while learning. Now imagine a manager who can get more of that lower-stakes production done with software. The manager still needs someone to deal with clients, check assumptions, challenge bad output, and own the consequence when something goes wrong. The temptation is obvious. Why spend months developing those capabilities if the hiring market already contains somebody who has them? A weak labor market makes that temptation easier to act on. The employer can wait longer, screen harder, and push more of the learning process outside the company. That does not mean formal training vanishes. EY's residency shows the opposite response is possible, but it reveals the economic question underneath the hiring threshold. Someone still has to pay for a worker to become useful. Historically, much of that cost sat inside the first few years of employment. If employers expect more judgment before hiring, part of that cost moves backward. It can show up in internships, extended training programs, project experience, or simply more time trying to qualify for the same label. The hiring bar is not only a statement about skill, it is a decision about who finances the process of acquiring that skill. Now put that beneath someone who is already 5 years into a white-collar career. The relevant advantage is not that their resume contains the number 5. It is what happened during those 5 years. They have watched a deadline move after a client changed the scope. They know the spreadsheet can be technically correct and still answer the wrong business question. They have seen priorities collide and learned which one the organization actually protects. They know when a polished answer deserves another hour of checking. That is context. And context is difficult to manufacture instantly because it comes from seeing decisions produce consequences. If employers increasingly prize judgment, review, and ownership, that kind of accumulated experience can become more economically important. That doesn't guarantee the worker a raise. It doesn't mean mid-career employees suddenly have unlimited bargaining power. A weak hiring market can make experienced workers more valuable to employers while still giving those employers considerable leverage. But the basis of the value can change. Producing more material may matter less than knowing what deserves to be produced. Being fast may matter less than knowing when speed creates risk. And the worker who once thought their routine experience was ordinary may discover that the ordinary part was exactly how judgment got built. Experience becomes scarce when companies want the result of learning without always funding the learning process. That creates a bigger problem than one difficult job description. Every individual company can rationally prefer someone who already knows the job. But the labor market as a whole cannot hire experienced workers unless somebody first gives inexperienced workers a place to become experienced. That is the apprenticeship problem, hiding inside the senior skill data. For decades, routine junior tasks quietly served two purposes. They produced work, and they produced workers. If managers increasingly automate, accelerate, or remove part of that first function, they eventually have to decide what replaces the second. Some may build residencies like EY. Some may create more deliberate mentoring or rotational work. Some may simply recruit people another company already trained. Each choice can make sense for the individual employer. Collectively, they determine whether the career ladder still produces enough people for its higher rungs. The evidence is not strong enough yet to say that ladder has broken. A stronger causal conclusion would require actual firm deployment timing, matched comparison employers, and evidence about who was ultimately hired, rather than only what the posting requested. If those data show the skill bar rising after deployment while comparable non-adopters stay flat, the AI case becomes much stronger. If the same seniorization spreads through low-exposure jobs, the labor market explanation becomes harder to ignore. For now, the visible change is narrower but still consequential. Employers are advertising more mature human capabilities earlier, especially where software overlaps most with the underlying work. The real shortage may be the experience entry-level jobs used to create.